The United States Navy is reviving its second fleet to patrol the North Atlantic Ocean. Washington says it's to counter growing threats from Russia. But what does this Cold War rhetoric mean, and how will Moscow respond? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hoda Abdelhamid. The U.S. has announced it is re-establishing its naval presence in the North Atlantic as Russia increases its patrol in the area too. It's part of a military buildup from both sides that hasn't been seen in decades. The Second Fleet was disbanded back in 2011 after more than 60 years of service. The reason? It was part of a restructuring program to save money at the time. We will discuss the real motives behind its revival with our guests in a moment, but first, Diane Easterbrook has this report.
The U.S. Navy says its Second Fleet will be back in commission this summer, operating out of Norfolk, Virginia. The fleet, which was eliminated in a cost-cutting move 7 years ago, is being reestablished to counter what the Pentagon calls a rising threat from Russia. At a ceremony in Norfolk on Friday, Admiral John Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, said, "Our national defense makes it clear that we are back in an era of great power competition as the security environment continues to grow more challenging and complex." Russia's Navy has stepped up patrols in the Atlantic, and both Russia and NATO have been building up forces in Eastern Europe at levels not seen in decades. While Russia has fewer ships than it did during the height of the Cold War, U.S. officials are especially concerned about its expanded submarine fleet and increased presence in the Atlantic Ocean. But one military expert sees this more as saber-rattling than an outright threat of war.
I think what the Russians will do is probably over time react with more submarines operating in the Atlantic, more messages to us that beware. But I think that this will be kept at a relatively low level, and I really don't see a huge escalation or any escalation proceeding from these actions.
The U.S. Second Fleet will be responsible for an area extending halfway across the Atlantic and will include a staff of more than 200. Diane Easterbrook, Al Jazeera.
The U.S. says its Second Fleet will counter what it calls Russian aggression, but Moscow sees the situation very differently. In 1990, the Soviet Union was given assurances by Western countries that NATO would not be enlarged beyond a reunited Germany. But those promises were quickly forgotten, and between then and now, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization continued expanding eastward, adding 13 more members. As it carried out major military interventions in the Balkans, Afghanistan, Libya, and beyond. No wonder then that U.S. plans to deliver a Patriot missile shield to Poland have been interpreted in Moscow as part of a plot to surround Russia. Let's now bring in our guests. Joining us from London, Olivier Guitta, Managing Director of GlobalStrat, a geopolitical risk and security consultancy firm. In Moscow, Dmitry Babich, a political analyst at Russia Profile magazine. And in Washington, D.C., Lawrence Korb, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Mr. Korb, let me start with you. So are we to assume now that the thinking in Washington is that the fight against ISIL and international terrorism is not a priority anymore, and rather that Russia is the real threat?
Well, basically, as Admiral Richardson, the Chief of Naval Operations, said, we're back in the era of great power competition. It doesn't mean that dealing with threats like ISIS in the Middle East have gone away, but what it means is they're not going to get as high a priority as we begin our buildup. Remember, this year our defense budget basically went from $600 billion to $700 billion, and what they're saying is this extra money is going to go to deal with great power competition, particularly Russia and China. It's not that we'll do less in the Middle East. It just will, these new forces we're adding will focus more on that area.
Okay, Dmitry Babich, how is all this viewed and received in Moscow?
Of course, very negatively, because we read the strategic national defense strategy written by James Mattis, the new defense secretary, which says that the emphasis will be carried from counterterrorism operations to what he called strategic competitions with Russia and China. I don't know what Russian patrols in the North Atlantic the American side is talking about. Right now, quite officially, there is an ongoing military naval exercise in the Black Sea conducted by the United States, its other NATO allies such as Spain and even Bulgaria, with more than 2,000 troops present from various countries, and they're exercising in about a few hundreds of miles from the Russian territory. So basically, the United States and their allies are conducting official exercises in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea. Look where the United States is located and where the Black Sea is located. So Russia, of course, views it as an attempt by the United States to achieve absolute superiority over Russia. Let me remind you that Russia, according to the data of Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, Russia spends on its defense 27% of what NATO's European allies are spending on their defense. And of course, the United States spends much more. So it's simply laughable to talk about any Russian aggression against the West, against the EU or against the United States. It's clear that the United States wants to be so strong that they would be able to carry out the first strike against Russia with impunity, or to be able to threaten Russia with this first strike. That's why President Putin, in his latest speech to the National Assembly, he unveiled these new weapons. There are very few of them, and the aim of them is dissuasion. Russia doesn't want to dominate the United States. We just want to be able to strike it with, 3 or 4 missiles that would stop the United States from threatening Russia or from starting a war, which would be a disaster for the whole world.
Well, NATO has been complaining for a while that Russian submarines were trying to detect the telecommunication cables between Europe and the U.S. Now, let me bring in Olivier Guitta. There's a lot of talk, a lot of hype that we're going back to the Cold War. At least in rhetoric, it sounds like it. But what's the reality?
I think it's much better in terms of what you can see as a peaceful environment, because I think it's muscle flexing from two men with large egos that will basically put their foot down and try to make do with the situation. But if you look at the larger picture, let's look at NATO, for instance. When President Trump came to power, NATO was clearly irrelevant. It had a lot of budget issues. And now, with its threats of making NATO irrelevant, President Trump is getting, little by little, some of the member countries to fund this. And more importantly, I think the Second Fleet, the message that is being sent is that look, if NATO is now relevant and you guys in Europe are going to start spending money, then we'll put our weight behind it. And that's what I think is really the message. In the larger picture, I'm not pessimistic in terms of a large tractic conflict. But what we can see is, contrary to what pundits said when President Trump was elected, is not in Putin's pocket. And that is basically one of the aspects when it comes to today, is that the U.S. and Russia are on many topics, especially in the Middle East, on both sides of the aisle, if you will.
Well, Lawrence Korb, why now?
Well, I think and first of all, it's important to keep in mind when we say the Second Fleet, it's not adding more ships. They're just putting a headquarters staff there. The number of ships will not increase until like 2021 or so, and then they're talking about a long-term buildup. So what this basically says is we're going to put a group of staffers, a couple of hundred people there that will focus on that area of the world, which we have not focused on since the end of the Cold War. And then sometimes when we deploy ships, rather than sending to the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, the Fifth Fleet and Bahrain, that will send more patrols up to the North Atlantic. And the reason we are doing it, as Secretary Matt has been pointed out, Secretary Mattis said that we focus so much on counterterrorism, we forgot about great power competition. The Russians are increasing their military. They took over Crimea, for example. They basically are harassing American planes. They've buzzed our P-8 Poseidon planes that were flying up in the northern Atlantic, and we're doing the same with China. We're basically saying, as we increase our defense capabilities, which had gone down when the Congress put the Budget Control Act that prevented the Pentagon from buying what it wanted, that from now on we're going to give the priority to dealing with great power competition. And as you pointed out, the Russians are also, threatening to, break up the cables under the Atlantic. They're getting their ships closer and closer to the U.S. Mainland. So basically, now we have a staff there that's going to be able to direct the ships. But I wouldn't overreact like the United States just got a couple hundred new ships that it's going to be sending there. The number of ships is at an all-time low. It's not even at 300. We're trying to get it over 300, as I mentioned, by the next decade. But that's basically it. It's to say, just as we have with the Seventh Fleet with China, now this is where we're going to place our priorities, because the danger of great power competition is much less than to our security than what, for example, happens with ISIS in northern Iraq.
Okay, Dmitry Babich, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, sort of pointed the finger at the U.S., saying it was using a confrontational approach. But if we also look at Moscow, the annexation of Crimea, its deep involvement in Syria, overflights in certain parts of Western Europe, don't you also think that Moscow played a role maybe in creating this sort of atmosphere of suspicion?
Well, let me get some facts straight here. Russia never threatened to disrupt the communication cables between NATO member countries. It was the UK Defense Secretary, Gavin Williamson, who said he suspected Russia of being willing to tamper with these cables. I think it's a 100% provocation, just like what Olivier said, when just about all of the Western press and a lot of Western politicians kept saying a year ago that President Trump was in Putin's pocket. That was obviously a lie, not even an overstatement, but a lie, because Trump has since done a lot of things which are definitely not pleasant to Russians. So there are many, inventions here. The West creates phantom threats to its own defense, and then says that Russia is actually making these phantoms real, that Russia is a real threat. Talking about Crimea, let me remind you that Crimea went back to Russia after there was a violent coup in Kiev, which made Ukraine a hostile state to Russia. There was a completely new regime that came to power in Kiev. For Russia, it is a tragedy. It is like Canada suddenly becoming a hostile state to the United States. The NATO troops are now, they've been able to get as close as 300 miles away from Moscow, thanks to Ukraine, now being willing to join NATO and inviting NATO troops to its territory. So from the purely military point of view, of course, Russia's situation has got a lot worse since the times of the Cold War. And I don't quite agree with Olivier when he says that it's just two men with huge egos. No, certainly it's not two men. The problem is that the problem is not with men, but with ideology. I think the situation now is a lot worse than in the worst times of the Cold War. In the early 60s, when the Soviet Union and China, two nuclear superpowers, when they were communist and they threatened the status quo powers, saying that their ideology was so much better, they wanted to change the regime in the West. Now Russia and China are status quo powers. But they are in the minority. They were in the minority in the 60s, and they are in the minority militarily and economically even now. Now the richest and the most powerful militarily countries in the world, the United States, the UK, France, they openly say that they want to change the regime in Russia, they want to improve the regime in China, and they openly speak about military confrontation. Russia and China avoid this kind of rhetoric. Economically, China can outpace even the United States now. Why would it be interested in a military confrontation? Russia is the same. Russian elite for many years was willing to join the Western elite. It made a lot of concessions, like surrendering our positions in Eastern Europe in order to become a part of the West. Now there is a feeling of great disappointment in Russia and a feeling of great threat from the West. That's why we have these, what you call overflights of NATO ships in the Baltics. Look where the United States is, and look where Russia is. Baltics is basically a sea which borders on Russia. The British troops are now in Estonia, a few dozens of miles from Russia's second capital, St. Petersburg. We never had such a situation, not even before the World War II. So that's why Russia feels insecure.
So, Olivier Guitta, is Russia right to feel insecure? U.S. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis says it's all about deterrence. But is that really the main motive behind all of this? And also, how is the rest of the world going to look at this sort of or perceived military expansion?
A couple of things. I mean, we have to go back to the Obama presidency, where basically President Putin, so rightly so, Obama as a paper tiger, and Obama with his failing Middle East policy left a void open for Russia to come in. Remember, 8 years ago, we didn't speak about Russia's involvement in the Middle East. So now we're going back to the drawing board, and what we're seeing with President Trump's character and way of doing business is much more asserting America's role in the world as much as possible in terms of the different threats. So I think that in terms of the perception, many might see that, you know, it's an escalation. I think it's just a rebalancing, because the US under Obama was totally absent from the world stage in that fashion. And remember, the EU and especially the Nordic countries are extremely concerned about potential Russians' involvement in their countries. And that's why we've seen this revival of NATO, and we've seen that the US is coming, at least on paper, to the help of the EU. In the larger scheme of things, what we've seen, Syria is one of the examples where we have not seen extreme escalation, while there are a lot of threats. A lot of things could have gone bad. So what we can see is that there is some kind of modus vivendi that is happening in Syria. And I suspect this modus vivendi will happen across the world. I am far from being pessimistic on this whole issue that, as I said, I think it's just saber rattling, and it's basically has to stick with the geopolitics and the US coming back to being the main force on the geopolitical chessboard.
So Lawrence Korb, can we look at this as part of making America great again?
Well, I think what it really is rebuilding our defense capability, which, as I mentioned, was hurt when the Congress was more worried about the debt and passed what we call sequestration or the Budget Control Act, and also using the extra money not to fight terrorism, but to go back to traditional deterrence. And the idea is not to attack Russia, but the idea is to have a presence there to deter Russia or those in Russia who might want to become aggressive, that if they do, they'll deal with the United States. And remember, NATO is building up. They're the ones who adopted the idea that they should spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. The United States obviously is happy with this, because Americans don't want to think that they're the only ones who are spending an awful lot of money on defense. But even if you look at our defense budget, it's less than 4% of our gross domestic product. So the idea that this is a big rearmament, no. And as I mentioned earlier, this second fleet is just a staff. And what it means is that sometimes ships that might have gone to the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain are going to go now to the northern Atlantic. And again, the fact of the matter is that the Ukrainian people got rid of their dictator, who fled to Russia, by the way. It wasn't the U.S. that was encouraging. If a country wants to join NATO, that's really up to them. We are not saying you have to join or you shouldn't join. It's really those people in those countries who have made that decision to join because they are concerned about what Russia is up to. And Putin doesn't help. The speech he gave on March 1st sounded like, Khrushchev during the Cold War when he said, "We will bury you." He's talking about hypersonic, ballistic missiles. He showed a picture of Florida where Trump has his summer White House to say, that might attack. So Putin is his own worst enemy, not to mention the fact that the Russians interfered in our election. The real question, did it help Trump or not? But the fact of the matter is, they not only interfered in our election, they interfered in elections in other countries in Europe. So the Russians have become much more aggressive than they were before Putin took over as his second term as president.
But one could also see it from the Russian point of view. There were guarantees given back in 1990, 1991 during the negotiations over the reunification of Germany that NATO wouldn't expand eastwards. Those promises were not kept. I mean, public confidential documents of the time now made public reveal that. So the Russians' position when they say, well, NATO didn't respect their promises, their word, why should we also have to sort of protect ourselves? We also have to take bold moves.
Well, again, if you go back and you take a look, there is a lot of debate about that, where the then Secretary of State Jim Baker said to Russian Foreign Minister Shevardnadze whether, in fact, that really happened. There's some debate about that. But the fact of the matter is, we did not force those countries to join NATO. They asked to join NATO, and they are freely elected governments who made that decision, just as they asked to join the European Union. And just as Georgia and Ukraine asked about joining NATO and the European Union, we didn't tell them to do. And countries should have the right to make their own decisions, because Russia is not happy, with it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm just going to put this to Dmitry Babich. I see that you have something to say there, but briefly, because I also want to speak to Olivier Guitta if we have some time.
Yeah, I understand. Well, just very quickly, point by point, first, Lawrence said that Russia was not active in the Middle East 10 years ago, and it became active when Obama was the president. It was not Russia who promoted the revolutions in the Middle Eastern countries, which led to this renewed Russian involvement. It was the United States and the European Union who supported the insurgency in Syria in 2011, presumably peaceful in the beginning, but very quickly turning into a civil war. And Russia was invited to Syria by the government when the so-called Islamic State was making progress there, was expanding, despite 11 months of airstrikes from the Western powers, which were obviously not very enthusiastic because the ISIS kept expanding in 2015 when Russia came on stage. Talking about Russia's aggression and Ukraine and Crimea,
Dmitry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. I'm sorry, we have reached the end of the program. Thanks to all our guests, Olivier Guitta, Dmitry Babich, and Lawrence Korb. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hoda Abdelhamid, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.